Another way of writing blade templates is by using components, which kind of look like custom HTML tags. So let's extract this navigation section right here into its own component. So I'm going to cut this out from here. And before we write the component, we need to create one. We can use the artisan command to do that. So we'll do vendor bin sale shell. Let's clear that out. We'll do PHP artisan make component, and we'll call this component nav. Now, as you can see, this command has created two files. One is the component nav.php class within the view components namespace, and another one is the actual nav blade template. Let's open the nav blade template. So we'll do nav blade template, and we'll paste in the code that we copied or cut from the layout. I also want to show you the new directories that have been created. So in here, under the resources views, we see the new directory called components have been created, and that's what contains our blade components. The other directory is within the app view with the components directory that contains nav.php class. So this is the class that renders this blade component. So if we open that up, we see that it extends a component class, and it has one method in addition to the construct method called render, which renders our nav component. Now let's render this nav component within the layout because we removed it from here, so we need to add that back. As I mentioned before, blade components look kind of like HTML tags. So we're going to be able to render this by using the name of the component, which is nav, prefixed by x and dash. So we'll do x dash and then the name of the component, which will follow the kebab case convention. So in our case, that's simply just nav, and we'll self-close this tag. We could also place our components within subdirectories, in which case we would need to use the dot notation or the dot character to specify from which directory to load this specific component. So for example, if we had this nav within a subdirectory here called maybe navigation, and we place this in there, then we would need to render this using navigation, which is the name of the directory, dot nav, which is the name of the actual component. Now you might be asking, since this nav.php class is simply rendering this component, what's the use of this nav class? Do we even need this component class? The answer to that is no, we don't need this class. In fact, if we delete this entirely and refresh the page, we see that it still works. Now, something to note here, in case you get an error about class not found, you may need to clear the view cache for this to work. So if you get some kind of error, try running artisan view clear command, and then it should render and work as expected. Now, the reason this still works is because the component that we initially created that has the component class is called class-based component. It gives you a little bit more control over your component. So if you need more control or you're doing something more complicated, having the class that manages your blade component makes things a bit easier because it gives you the control of what's being passed to it, maybe add some logic to it, and so on. Components that don't have a class, like this one, for example, since we got rid of the nav class, are called anonymous components. They just have the blade templates. They don't have the corresponding class. So let's actually move this back here since we don't need this nested. And let's fix this here as well. And we can actually create anonymous components using the same artisan command that we used before. We just need to pass the view option to it. So let's try it out and maybe create another component. Looking at the transactions blade template, I think it would be good if we extracted this statistic cards into a component. As you can see, we have few of these cards, right? If we open the page and go to the transactions, we see that we have 4 cards. Technically, we could extract this into a component and then reuse the same component to render 4 of these cards. In our case, we are simply duplicating these 4 times and rendering it that way. So instead, we want to make this somewhat reusable and use blade components for that. So let's copy this, and we're going to create a new anonymous component. So we'll do PHP artisan make component, and we'll call this stat, and we'll pass the view option, which means that it's not going to create the class for this component, it's just going to create the blade template, making it an anonymous component. As you can see, the stat blade template has been created. In fact, actually, I want to create it within a directory. We'll create it within maybe cards directory and nest it under it. And we'll delete the previous one that was created. So let's delete this one and we'll work with this. So let's paste the HTML that we copied before, and let's adjust this to our needs. Something to note here is that when we created these components, we capitalized the first letter of the component name. And in addition to the component name, we're also capitalizing the first letter of the directory. But Laravel automatically converts that into all lowercase when creating the blade templates. However, it does not do that for the class. That's because the Laravel follows the conventions, and it will also convert the Pascal case to kebab case when creating blade templates. So if we created something like stat card, you will see that stat card was converted to kebab case with a dash, but the class component remains in Pascal case. Alright, so this HTML in here on its own is not good enough, as you can imagine, because it has this amount and the colors kind of hard-coded. So if we were to use this component 4 times, it would render the same text here and the same amount, which is not what we want. We want to make this reusable. So why don't we replace these hard-coded texts here with some variables. So we'll call this amount, and we can call this label. Now let's render this component from our transactions blade. Let me close the other view files here. We're going to comment all of these out, and instead we'll render our reusable components. So we'll do x cards.stat, and we'll do this 4 times, and then we need to pass as attributes. So we'll do label total income, and this will be amount 50,000, and we'll do the same thing for others. All right, so let's go to the browser. Let's refresh the page, and sure enough, we see that everything is working except the icons, because we haven't worked with that yet, but the label and the amount seems to be working. The one thing that I want to improve on is I want to not have this passed as formatted. Instead, I want to kind of delegate the formatting to the component itself. So like we may want to pass the raw value from some kind of database or some kind of storage where we're not storing it like this, and we're just formatting it for display within the component. So what we can do is that in here, we can add the $, and then maybe add something like number format, amount, and format it to 2 decimal points. Now, of course, you would probably extract these to some kind of helper function that would do your formatting to stay consistent across your application. But we're going to keep things simple for the purposes of this demo. So let's replace this now to 50,000, and we'll replace this to 45,000, and this to 5,000, and same here, and this should still work as expected. So if we go in here, we refresh, we see that it still works. The problem with this is that we are still hard coding these numbers. Even though our component is accepting variables, the blade template here, the transactions.blade, is passing hard-coded values. In real app, we would be getting the amount probably from a variable passed down from controller. So why don't we replace these with some variables? So we'll do total income, total expense, net savings, and the goal. Let's pass these variables from our route because we're not using the controller here. So for the transactions route, we'll pass these values in here. Now, this of course works. However, there is a potential issue here. We're passing down these variables this way, which essentially just evaluates this value and passes down as string. And we may not want to do that. We may want to get the raw PHP variable data type, for example, within our component. For example, if I go in here and we do die dump amount and we refresh the page, we see that the 50,000 is string. However, what do you think is going to happen if we pass another data type like an array or an object? So let's say that the goal for whatever reason was an array and we pass that into the cards component and we wanted to accept that as an array for whatever reason. So if we go in here and change this to an array, and let's get rid of this die dump and then refresh the page, we see that we're getting this error that argument 1 passed to HTML special cars must be string, but array was given. That's because when we are passing the value this way, what this does is that Blades takes this variable and passes it to the HTML special chars because remember this essentially translates to the same thing as PHP echo e value, and whatever this is, in this case the goal, is being passed to this helper function. And we may not want to do that. We want to pass this variable as like a raw variable to our component. To do that, we need to prefix these attributes with colon. So if we add colon to these and then get rid of these double curly braces from here and here, and what this does is that when you prefix an attribute name with colon, Blade treats that attribute as a piece of raw PHP data rather than a literal string. And it accepts the PHP expressions, variables, so you can evaluate some PHP expressions in here. For example, instead of goal, we could pass a timestamp and this will still work. Now, of course, the time doesn't make sense for a goal, but just for the sake of example, we see that it works. So it is capable of evaluating PHP expressions. So if we change this back to goal and we pass this as an array, it is going to still fail, but with a different error. Now it's failing because number format is expecting integer or float, but we're giving it an array. We can die dump the amount in here, and let's actually maybe move this on top because otherwise it would die dump in here and we would never get to the goal. So let's go here, refresh, and you see that it's passing in as an array. All right, so let's change this back. Let's remove the die dump from here. And now let's maybe fix the icon colors. Before we do that, actually, what if you wanted to customize the attributes of the div element right here? Maybe you want to change the background color or position things differently, or just simply add some other HTML attributes. Say we wanted to add the title to this div container. Maybe we wanted to do something like title, total reported income, which could be like a longer description of what this statistic card is about. Now, if we refresh the page, we're getting the same number format. Oh yeah, the goal that we're passing is still an array. So let's revert that back. Let's open the browser, refresh. And if we hover over this, we see that there is no title. In fact, we can inspect element and we see that there is no title attribute. Attributes that are passed to the component are added to something called components attribute bag. It's like an object basically and can be accessed via the attributes variable. So if we go in here, we can die dump attributes variable. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, And as you can see, the attributes is an object of component attribute bag, and the attributes array contains three elements: title, label, and amount. So to add these attributes to our HTML element, we can just do something like attributes, and this is going to automatically add the attributes to this div element. The reason this works is because the object implements PHP's magic toString method, which allows it to render it as a string. So if we go here and refresh the page and hover over, we see that the title now works. If we inspect the element, however, we see that in addition to the title attribute, we're also getting the label attribute and the amount attribute. And we may not want this to happen. We may only want to add the title attribute, and the label and amount are kind of like props. They are variables that are passed to the component, but we don't want that to be part of the HTML attributes. So these amount and the label variables are your data variables. And if you were using class-based components, you would define your data variables in your constructor as public properties. And then Laravel would automatically exclude those properties from the attribute bag. However, since we're using the anonymous component, it is not automatically excluding those because we're not defining these data variables anywhere as being data variables. They're just regular variables and regular attributes as far as the Laravel is concerned. However, we can hint the component that these two are our data variables or our props so that they get excluded from the attributes bag. And we can do that by using the props directive. So we'll call the props directive at the top here and pass list of variable names that are our props or data variables. So we'll do label and amount. And now if we refresh the page again, we see that only title is added to the attributes, and the other amount and the label attributes are no longer considered HTML attributes. They are excluded because they are props. So basically all other attributes that are not part of the props directive will be added and available within the attribute bag. You can even give the attribute a default value in the props by using the key as your variable name and the value as your default value, and it will work. So for example, if the label was not given for whatever reason, we could give it some default label, and then within our transactions blade template, maybe let's say we don't pass the label for the goal card component, and if we refresh, we see that the default label is added because that's the default value that we are setting within the props directive. Now, what if we wanted to override some of the classes within here? Maybe we want to have the gray background instead of the white background here. We could pass the class attribute within the transactions blade template and set the background color using the Tailwind CSS class and see if that will work. So let's remove this title from here, and instead I'm going to add class bg gray 100, and let's open the browser, refresh the page, and as you can see, it is not being applied. We can inspect element on this component, and we see that that class is not being applied. That's because within the component, we are already defining the class attribute that sets the background to white using the bgWhite Tailwind CSS utility class. To make this work, we need to merge the past class attribute values with the class attribute values that are defined within this component. We can use the merge method on the attributes variable to do that. So we can do something like attributes merge and pass list of attributes to merge. So we'll do class and set the class to these values. And now what's going to happen is that any additional classes passed to this component will get merged to these classes. So if we go to the browser and refresh the page, we see that the class for the gray background was added to the list of classes here, but the background is not changing. That's because the CSS is conflicting here since we have two background classes defined. We have the background white and background gray, and it's setting the white as the background. Now we have a couple of options here. One is we could make the gray as important, basically using the CSS important rule to overwrite that. So we could go in here and add important this way. That's how it works in Tailwind. And if we go back and refresh the page, we see that now the background was changed to gray. But we still have these two classes in here, and that may not always be what you want, because you don't want to rely on the order of classes for things to work. You may want to only have the white background in certain cases and otherwise take the background from the component that renders this specific component. So to do that, we could use something called conditional merging. With conditional merging, you are able to define the condition on when to render a specific class. So let's get rid of this from here. And here we can use class method. And instead of class this way, we can pass the list of classes this way. And we can actually separate these as its own classes and not like a one string. So we can do background white, shadow, and everything else. Now we're just going to keep this as one, but you could separate those out if you wanted to. If we go here and refresh, we see that all of those are still added. And we still have both the white background and the gray background, with white taking the precedence. So if we go in here, when you have the numeric indexes on the elements that you pass here, it will always be added or merged to the resulting class. However, if you set this to be the key, and then the value be the truthy value, whether it's true or false, some kind of conditional, then it will only be rendered or added if whatever this evaluates to returns true. So if we set this to true and go in here and refresh the page, everything is still normal. We still have the white background. However, if we go here and set this to false and refresh the page, we see that now we no longer have that BG white in the list of classes here. So this can come in handy if you want to do some conditional merging of the classes. The background color may not be the perfect example for this, but you get the idea. Now, one thing I want you to note is that the merging non-class attributes has different effect. Instead of merging values, it is going to replace them. So let's say we wanted to bring the title back here. So we set this to total income as our title. And then we wanted to set some kind of default title here if the title is not passed. What we can do is, again, we would call the merge method, and you can call the merge method after the class method, and merge title with some default title. Now, if we go to browser and refresh the page, we see that this is total income because we're passing the total income for the first component, but for the other three components, we're setting the default title. So as you can see here, it's replacing the default title with the title that we pass. All right, so let's now fix up the colors here. We want these to be reusable, right? So we want to change the colors appropriately depending on what color we pass from the transactions blades template, because we want this to be green and the other one we want it to be red, and then we want it to be blue, and the last one is yellow. So why don't we do something like pass color green, and then do the same thing here, and this will be red, blue, and yellow. And you could call this anything. It doesn't have to be color. It could be theme or whatever, but we're gonna call this color for now. Let me double check our colors. So we have the green, the red, blue, and the yellow. So it's background yellow 100, blue 100, green 100, and red 100. That's for the background. And then we also have the text. This is text yellow 500, blue 500, green 500, and red 500. So these are the two variables that we need to control dynamically using these. Let's get rid of the title, and we can get rid of the class here since we don't need it. Let's also get rid of these attributes here because we don't need conditional classes, or we don't need to merge any attributes or classes in this case. So I'm simply just going to get rid of this and call class equals and kind of bring it back to the way it was originally. Then we want to replace this text green 500 and the background 100 with the proper color that we will calculate or map to based on these values. Now, one quick and dirty way to do this is by simply replacing this green right here with the variable that we pass. So we pass the color, so we can replace this as well, color, and this is going to work. So if we go here and refresh the page, we're getting error called undefined variable color, which kind of makes sense because color that is being passed is not a variable, it's an attribute. And this color is available under attributes. So if we did something like attributes color, this would work. So if we did this way and refresh the page, we see that it works. Now, even though this works, we may want to use the variable like we're doing for the label in here. In that case, we can change this back to color, and we can make color be the prop, just like the label and the amount. So if we add color in here and we refresh the page, we see that it still works. Now, depending on how you're loading and bundling Tailwind, this could lead to issues with Tailwind's purging process and not work as you would expect. Tailwind basically may not include the BG green 100, red 100, yellow 100, and so on classes because it may not know that we are using those classes since we're building them dynamically like that. And Tailwind has something called purging process that it essentially purges all the utility classes from the generated or built file that are not in use. And since Tailwind cannot figure out basically what class you're building here, since it's dynamic, it won't be able to include those classes in the generated file. Therefore, this is not advised in a lot of cases. Unless, of course, you add some kind of exclusions in your Tailwind configuration, and then you could make it work. So in general, it's probably best to use the full class names and not dynamically built class names this way. Unless, of course, like I said, you know Tailwind and you know how to add exclusions and all that. So to solve this problem, we could have some kind of map or a simple lookup table that basically maps the color that we passed, like green, to the proper full Tailwind CSS background color and the text color. So we could have some kind of lookup table here. So let's do PHP and PHP, and we could call this color classes. Then in here, we're going to replace this with color classes variable and access the proper list of color classes using the color variable as the key. So let's do the same thing for the text in here, and this should still work as expected. Let's refresh the page, and as you can see, everything still works. So there are a lot more features, of course, and I cannot cover all of them. I would suggest to go through the documentation and get yourself familiar with the Blade overall directives and components if you plan on using Blade as your frontend. You can do things like I mentioned, conditional merging of attributes, attribute filtering, can define dynamic components where component name can be specified as a variable. You could also use class directive to apply classes conditionally. You can define inline components in your class-based components and so on. Speaking of class-based components, as I mentioned before, they are great for when you need more control and have more complex components. You can invoke public methods defined in your component classes from your templates, and you can also conditionally render your components by defining the shouldRender method in your component class, and if it returns false, the component won't be rendered at all. For the most part, it will be using the anonymous components, so my advice would be don't use class-based components for every single component. Start with the anonymous component and then reach for the class-based components when you actually need more control and features. You can also sort of think of class-based components as like a controller where you prepare the data for your component and then pass it down to your blade template or your blade component. You could reach into other services, use service container within your class component, and so on. All right, so now let's change our layout to use components instead of template inheritance in here. So as you can see, we're still using the yield, the section, and so on. So we want to replace these to fully use blade components. So first thing that we need to do is we need to move our layout under components. Then we're going to replace this content section with the slot variable. So we'll do slot, and slot is like a placeholder that renders the additional content that is passed to this component. So like if we go to our dashboard blades template as an example, instead of extends here, we could simply use the layout component like HTML tag. So we would do something like X layout and then anything that goes in between, because so far in our transactions we've had components that are kind of self-closing HTML tags, right? So in here we could put something in between, and whatever we put here, that content gets passed as the slot variable. So we could put something like hello here. Let's get rid of this for now. If we open our dashboard, we see that it works. We may have more than one slots because we may want to render some additional content in different places. Like in here, for example, we're yielding the title. Instead of that, we can simply use named slots. So we'll just render a variable called title this way if it's passed, and if it's not, then we'll simply render the default title, which is Laravel in this case. Then within our dashboard page, we can inject the content for this named slot using X slot. So we can do something like X-slot and then specify the name of the slot, in this case being title, and then pass the value to it. So we'll say dashboard. And if we go to the browser and refresh the page, we see that the Laravel got changed to dashboard. Next, we have this header section in here, including the header title. Let's replace this with another named slot. So we'll do header title, and if it's not given, then we'll do default title. Now from our dashboard page, we can either again pass it as a named slot content, or it will render as the default title. So if we open the browser, we refresh the page, we see that it's rendering default, or we can pass it as a slot. So we can do this and do header title and pass dashboard as well. Refresh the page, and sure enough, it works. Now, if it's a simple text that we're rendering here and it's not like a HTML or anything complex, we can pass this as an attribute to our layout component. So we can get rid of this entirely, and we can actually get rid of the title entirely as well. And we can do title dashboard and header title using the kebab case also dashboard. And then if we refresh the page, we see that it still works as expected. And our component looks much cleaner. If you have both the named slot and the attribute defined with the same name, then the slot content takes precedence. So we could do something like X slot header title and set some header title here, which will basically override what's defined in here. So we can do something like new title and then refresh the page here, and as you can see, it overwrites. And as I mentioned, we can pass some HTML here, so we can do something like span class text, maybe green 500, and close the tag here and refresh the page, we see that it works. Note that any content that is not defined explicitly as a named slot, like this X slot in here, will be passed to the component within the slot variable. So if we forgot to put this in here and just put span this way, this will just be rendered together within the slot variable. All right, so let's update the other pages as well. Let's copy this and let's do the categories page next. Let me close that out. Let's replace this and we'll call these categories and categories. And we can do categories page. Let's go to the browser, visit categories, and sure enough, it works. We have dashboard, we have categories. Now let's do the transactions page. So let's copy this, open transactions page. I'm going to replace this with the layout component, and let's change the title to transactions, and we'll change this to a transactions page. And for the header, what we can do is that we can simply pass these two div within here this way. And let's get rid of this whole thing. Let's refresh the page. Let's go to transactions, and sure enough, it works. But it's adding this content instead of overriding or setting this properly on top before the actual content. That's because with template inheritance, we were using the section and using the parent directive to extend the header with this additional content. But right now we are essentially putting all of this content within the slot variable, which is rendered right here. And instead we wanted to render it in here. We can fix this in multiple ways. One way is that we can check if the header slot is set. And if it is set, then we'll render that. Otherwise, we'll render the default header. Then within our page template, within the transactions blade, we'll simply render this whole thing within the header slot. So we'll do X slot header and close that, and anything within that will be passed basically to this header variable and rendered under here. So if the header is set, we'll render that, otherwise we'll render the default header. So let's open the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, now it replaced the header, so we're getting close. It's still not extending it, so that's something that we need to fix next. Let's maybe extract this into its own header component so that we can do something like X header and then pass the header title here. Otherwise, we'll do default title. Let's create that component in here. So we'll do header blade.php and we'll replace this with slot because anything that we pass within the X header will be passed here as a content. Now to make this extendable, we could introduce another variable called extend header boolean variable that we can check if it's true. Then we'll render the default header here, and if it's false, we'll just render this. So we can do something like if extend header is set to true, and by default we'll set it to false if nothing is passed, we can render this as well in here, and otherwise we'll render the header all the time. And this is whatever we pass if we want to customize header ourselves. So now we can pass the extend header as a prop to our layout component. So we can do extend header and set it to true. And remember, this is a PHP expression, so it's going to be passed as true. And if we refresh, we see that now it's rendering as before. We're basically extending the header, rendering the parent header, and then rendering our custom header. So we're doing somewhat similar to what we were doing with the template inheritance. Now, of course, there are many different ways of achieving this. Mine may not be the cleanest, but you basically get the idea. Blade and Laravel in general are very flexible. All right, so one thing that I want to fix before moving on is the current page highlighting. Right now, if you go from dashboard to transaction or to category, the dashboard page or in the navigation is always highlighted. So within our navigation component, we have this hint here that we want to set the background gray 900 with text white for the current page, which is what's set for the dashboard page. And then default for non-current pages, it should be this. So what we're going to do is that we're going to check if the current page matches with the URL in here by using the request helper or the request facade. And then based on that, we'll decide what classes to add. So we can get rid of this and we can do request is and check for this. And if it is, we'll do this. Otherwise, we'll do the default. So let's paste this in here. And then we'll do the same thing for other pages as well. So let's copy this. And as you can imagine, you could extract this into a helper function or a helper method, or even to a separate component that handles that for you. But I just want to show you a working example in here, and then you can extract it yourself. So we'll do this here as well. So we'll get rid of this and replace it with this, and the same thing here. We'll get rid of this and replace it with this. And this is going to be transactions, and this will be categories. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, now transactions is highlighted. We can go to categories and we can go to dashboard. As I mentioned, we could clean this up by extracting it into its own component or to its own method and a helper function, but I'm going to leave that up for you to do as an exercise. You could also do this aria current on your own. You should conditionally set this to page if it's a current page and to false if it's not current page. Aria current is used for assistive technologies like screen readers. Now, as you notice, that this is method call here basically checks for the URI. What if you wanted to check for the route name? We can do that by using the route is method, and that essentially determines if the incoming request has a matching named route. So we can do route is transactions, same thing here, route is categories, and route is home. And we just need to ensure that our routes are named in here. So we're going to name this home, and we have transactions in here. So let's name this categories. Now, if we go to the browser, refresh the page, we see that it still works. The additional benefit of using route names instead of the URIs here to do the matching is that you can do something like .star, and it's going to match to any route name that starts with categories. So it can match with pages like categories index, show, edit, and so on, and it will still highlight the categories page in the navigation bar. Alright, so this is it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy my videos, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.